Welcome to Animal Quests. I'm Austin. Today we're diving into the collection of shark cage diving stories where people stepped into cages built to protect them, only to find out that protection means nothing once the rules start bending. From a man off Guadalupe Island who reached outside the cage for a cleaner camera angle, to a woman near Port St. John's who thought calmer, shallower water meant less danger, but ended in the craziest way possible. It was October 2nd, 2016, and the early morning fog hanging over the Pacific was just beginning to thin near Guadalupe Island, nearly 150 miles off the coast of Baja California. The water below looked dark and endless, broken only by the slow rolling wake of the dive boat. Guadalupe had built a reputation as one of the best places on Earth to see great white sharks up close, which was exactly why Colton Riggs had spent almost 4 months saving for the trip. Colton was 27 years old, from Reno, Nevada, and worked long shifts as a warehouse mechanic when he wasn't filming content for his growing social media pages, wildlife clips, abandoned buildings, cliff dives, anything risky enough to grab attention. He wasn't famous, but he had enough followers to believe one truly viral photo could change his life. He had been thinking about it for weeks before the trip even began, a selfie with a great white shark filling the frame behind him. No bars, no cage, just him and the ocean's apex predator in a single image that nobody could scroll past. I can see by Colton's attitude that he is going to do everything just to make his viewers happy, even if it means doing risky things. The operator running the expedition was fully licensed and widely respected. Before the cages touched the water, the crew walked everyone through a thorough safety briefing. Stay inside the cage. Keep all limbs behind the bars. Do not extend cameras outside under any circumstance. The latch key for each cage was kept on the equipment table near the stern, handled only by crew members. Colton nodded through the briefing while adjusting his 2 cameras, one mounted safely to the bars, the other a wide-angle handheld, the kind built for selfies, with a flip screen so you could frame yourself without guessing. But he was only half listening. He had already spotted the cage latch key on the equipment table, and somewhere between the briefing and the moment the crew turned away, he palmed it quietly into his wetsuit pocket. The selfie he had been imagining needed open water. The cage door was the only thing standing between him and it. The surface cage was lowered into the water with Colton inside alone. The visibility that morning stretched nearly 100 feet below him, clear enough to see shapes moving deep before they reached the bait line. Great white sharks are built for explosive vertical attacks. Large females near Guadalupe regularly exceed 15 feet and can weigh over 2,000 pounds, capable of launching upward at terrifying speed in a single committed burst. The first shark arrived within minutes, a female estimated around 14 feet long. She circled beneath the cage while the crew worked the bait line. Colton watched her move and felt the shot forming in his mind. He could already picture the composition. Himself in the foreground, the shark rising massive behind him, the deep blue of the Pacific dropping away beneath them both. No bars cutting across the frame. No steel. Just the image. Then the shark disappeared below the cage. That should have been the warning. Instead, Colton pulled out the stolen latch key and worked it into the cage lock. The door swung open. He turned his back to the open water, raised the wide-angle camera toward his own face, and tilted it to capture the ocean behind him. He was framing his selfie. Below him, the shark was already accelerating upward. The breach happened so fast that several people on deck didn't process what they'd seen until after the water exploded white around the cage. The shark struck upward through the open door from behind and clamped across Colton's shoulder and upper arm in a single violent snap, the force instantly fracturing bone before the animal twisted away. The damage was catastrophic. The bite severed the brachial artery near the shoulder joint. Blood clouded the water within seconds. The crew hauled the cage upward immediately, but severe arterial bleeding in open water gives almost no margin for recovery. By the time they pulled Colton onto the deck, he was already losing consciousness. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Investigators reviewed footage from the mounted cage camera. The video showed the cage door swinging open from the inside, Colton turning his back to the water, and the camera raised toward his own face in the final seconds. Colton Riggs had not acted on impulse. He had planned it from the moment he saw that key on the table. He came to Guadalupe for one image. He made his choice on land, carried it into the water, and the last thing he ever framed was his own face. I actually went cage diving once, and even with the bars between me and the water, my heart was pounding. Watching Colton step out makes me realize how different the mindset is when you're chasing a viral shot. Colton made one decision in 1 second that cost him everything, but at least his cage was intact when the shark came. For Paige, halfway around the world in the shark-infested waters off Gansby, The cage door itself would become the problem. It was July 14th, 2017, and a sharp winter wind was sweeping across the southern coast of Gansby, cutting through the small harbor town about 2 hours southeast of Cape Town. Gansby sits right next to a stretch of ocean known as Shark Alley, a narrow channel between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock where thousands of Cape Fur seal make their home. And where there are seals, there are great white shark. Lots of them. Paige Kendrick was 24 years old, a travel content creator from Brisbane, who had spent the last 8 months working her way across the African continent. She'd done the safari circuit in Kenya, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, hiked through Namibia, and now she was at what she'd been calling the grand finale of her trip. Her followers had voted on the final adventure through an Instagram poll a few weeks earlier, and shark cage diving in Gansby had won by a landslide. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I haven't watched 100 travel videos myself. They are actually incredible. But Paige was about to find out what happens when one rule gets ignored for even a few seconds. The operator she'd booked with was a well-established company that had been running tours in the area for over a decade. The morning briefing covered everything you'd expect. Keep your body centered in the cage, hands behind the bars. Don't grab the bait line. And critically, the top hatch of the cage would be opened and closed throughout the day as divers rotated in and out, so anyone inside needed to stay low and away from the opening when it was unsecured. Paige was in the second rotation that morning, sharing the cage with 3 other tourists. She'd brought a GoPro on a short pole and was planning to film vertical content for her stories. Above them, the crew had just finished pulling the bait line away after a pass and assumed the shark had dropped deeper and moved off the pattern. There was a brief exchange on deck, half heard over wind and engine noise, about rotating the next group. Believing they had a short window, one crew member cracked the hatch open early. Great white sharks are vertical ambush predators by design. They hunt seals by tracking them from the dark water below, then launching upward in a single explosive burst that can carry their entire body clear of the surface. It's called breaching, and Gansby is one of the only places on Earth where it happens with regularity. The shark hadn't left. The same large female, estimated at around 15 feet, had dipped out of sight only seconds earlier, then circled back deeper and faster than expected. Paige, now closer to the front, lifted her GoPro slightly toward the opening, just as the shadow came back up from below. What happened next wasn't clean. The shark surged upward and collided with the cage at an angle, its snout and upper body forcing partially through the open hatch. The impact drove the top bars downward and slammed Paige forward into the frame, pinning her upper body between the metal and the animal's head. The cage jolted violently. One diver lost grip and struck the side rail. Another inhaled water in the confusion. As the shark thrashed to pull free, its jaws snapped reflexively, catching Paige high along the shoulder and side of the neck. Not a clean bite, but enough to tear through soft tissue and muscle. The force twisted her sideways against the bars. Blood spread instantly into the water as the animal struggled against the cage opening. The entire sequence lasted only a few seconds, but inside the cage it felt much longer. When the shark finally wrenched itself free, the cage rocked hard enough to momentarily submerge the opening. Paige slipped downward, unresponsive, partially folded against the lower bars. The other divers were shouting, trying to stabilize themselves as the crew scrambled above. The cage was hauled up quickly, but by the time they got her clear of the water, Paige had already lost consciousness. The combination of traumatic injury, rapid blood loss, and water aspiration made resuscitation unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead on the deck before emergency services could be reached. The investigation that followed focused heavily on the timing of the hatch opening relative to the shark's last confirmed position. It wasn't outright recklessness, but a breakdown in communication and assumption, crew believing the animal had cleared the area when it hadn't. The operator suspended tours immediately and cooperated fully with maritime authorities. Paige wasn't just diving, she was chasing the perfect shot. That slight shift put her out of position at the worst moment. A reminder that one better angle can meet a moment with no second chances. Paige trusted a system that failed in a split second, but at least the shark wasn't being pulled right to her. For James, diving off Freeport, the danger wasn't a mistake. It was the bait drawing a tiger shark straight in. It was August 3rd, 2016, and the late summer heat was already pressing down over the Gulf waters off Freeport, Texas. From shore, the surface looked calm, but a few miles out, the current told a different story. Steady, insistent, pushing long swells beneath the hull. Visibility hovered around 25 to 30 feet, the water carrying that familiar green-blue haze that softened everything just beyond reach. Cage diving trips ran regularly in this stretch of water. Smaller operators worked farther offshore, relying less on rigid systems and more on experience. Bait lines were used to draw sharks in, typically positioned at a controlled distance from the cage. When handled properly, it created a narrow window, close enough for a clear view, far enough to keep the attraction point separate from the person inside. That separation was everything. James Finch was 31, working a physically demanding trade that kept him on long shifts most weeks. He was methodical by nature, not someone drawn to unnecessary risk. But sharks had been a constant interest since childhood. Years spent reading, watching, learning their behavior. He'd booked the trip months in advance, brought a small handheld camera with him. Nothing elaborate, just enough to document the experience. Before the dive, the crew delivered a standard briefing. Stay inside the cage, keep your body clear of the bars. Do not interfere with the bait line. The instructions were clear, routine, and James followed them without hesitation. I think the best part of James's story is that he actually listened. Many people ignore safety rules and treat them like background noise, but he took them seriously, and that changed everything. When his turn came, the cage was lowered, and he descended alone. At first, the water held only distance, faint movement at the edge of visibility, shapes that passed without committing. Then the pattern changed. Two larger forms emerged from below, tiger sharks, each estimated later between 10 and 12 feet. They didn't rush. They circled wide, deliberate arcs, testing the space before tightening their approach. Above, the crew worked the bait line. The current that morning was stronger than expected, pulling against the line in a steady lateral drift. Instead of correcting for it, shortening the tether or repositioning the angle, the line was left to move with the water. It didn't swing wildly. It shifted slowly, subtly, closing distance inch by inch. At the same time, slack formed. The bait dipped lower in the water column than intended, sinking closer to the depth of the cage rather than holding its offset position. No one adjusted it. No one pulled it back out. From inside, James tracked the movement, turning within the cage to keep both the sharks and the bait in view. He stayed within the bars, never reaching beyond them, never interfering. Everything he did stayed within the limits he'd been given. But of course, he did not forget to take a picture to capture this moment. Using his waterproof camera, he positioned himself in the camera where the shark can be seen in the background. While trying to take a picture, he did not notice that the space around him was changing. One of the sharks began to lock onto the bait. Its path straightened, movements becoming more direct with each pass. The drifting line, guided by current, continued to narrow the gap until the bait and the cage occupied nearly the same plane. The separation was gone. The shark's final approach came from below and slightly off-center, rising as it accelerated. Its focus was fixed entirely on the bait. With the line now within inches of the cage, the trajectory carried straight through the structure. The impact forced its snout and jaws between the bars. Inside, there was no time to react, no space to move. James was still positioned where he was taking a photo moments before, exactly where the bait had drifted toward. The bite was not exploratory. It was a full, committed strike. Its jaws closed on the bait, but the alignment placed his arm between metal and force. The pressure pinned it against the bars as the teeth cut through in a single motion. The shark recoiled almost immediately, pulling free, but the damage had already been done. It lasted only seconds. Above the surface, the crew reacted only after the water changed, after the strike had already happened. They began hauling the cage up immediately, but the delay between drift, recognition, and response left no margin. When they brought him onto the deck, the injury was catastrophic. Severe trauma to the arm, rapid and uncontrollable blood loss. A tourniquet was applied above the elbow, but the damage had progressed too far, too quickly. He lost consciousness before they were halfway back to shore. He was pronounced dead before they arrived. The investigation that followed focused on the operation itself. The findings pointed to inadequate bait line management, failure to compensate for current conditions, and unsafe proximity between the feeding zone and the cage. His camera was given back to his family, keeping it as a remembrance. A lot of you asked in the comments of my last video why I keep stressing operator responsibility. This case is exactly why. James followed every rule, but the crew's negligence erased the margin of safety. For our next story, climbing a ladder off Cocoa Beach, the danger wasn't the bait. It came from the one place nobody was watching. It was September 11th, 2015, and a warm Atlantic breeze was rolling across the shoreline of Cocoa Beach, Florida, just as the boat carrying Elena Riggs and her dive group reached the near-shore drop-off about 3/4 of a mile out. It's not a place anyone with experience would call safe for casual diving. Elena was 34 years old, a high school biology teacher from Orlando, who had been certified as an open water diver for almost 6 years. She wasn't reckless, and her social media wasn't full of dangerous stunts. What she didn't have, though, was experience with cage work, especially not with the kind of low-visibility, predator-attracting setup this operator was running. She'd booked the trip with 2 friends as a long-planned birthday weekend. The morning briefing had been short, almost casual. The crew explained the ladder transition system they used, where divers would rotate in and out of the cage one at a time, using a fixed metal ladder attached to the side. They warned the group to move quickly through the ladder zone and to keep all limbs inside the structure during the swap. What they didn't emphasize strongly enough, and what later turned out to be the central failure of the operation, was that limited chumming had already been introduced earlier to draw in sharks, and that feeding activity was developing below the boat. What made the setup more dangerous wasn't just the presence of chum, but the conditions around it. Visibility that morning was especially poor. Green, sediment-heavy water with only a few feet of clarity, and there was no dedicated spotter assigned to monitor the ladder zone. Anything approaching from below would have been effectively invisible until it was already within striking distance. It's hard not to see this as negligence. Even a moderate attractant setup, paired with blind water and unmonitored entry points, creates conditions that make transition points vulnerable. Bull sharks are widely considered one of the 3 most dangerous shark species on the planet, alongside great whites and tigers. They typically grow between 7 and 11 feet long and can weigh upwards of 500 pounds, with a bite force per square inch that's higher relative to body size than a great white. What makes them especially dangerous is their tolerance for shallow, murky water, their ability to thrive where visibility is near zero, and an aggression level documented in coastal attack reports. Elena was the second diver to swap out of the cage that morning. She'd finished her rotation and was at the ladder, partially out of the water, with her upper body above the surface and her legs still submerged inside the ladder frame. She paused for a few extra seconds, holding her phone in a waterproof case to film a quick clip of herself with the boat in the background. From below, the ladder area would have appeared as a broken silhouette against a dim surface, distorted by turbidity and glare. With no spotter calling out movement, no one registered what was rising beneath her. Below her, a bull shark estimated at around 9 feet had been drawn into the area. It came up fast and vertical, locked onto the silhouette of her lower body against the surface light. The strike hit her across the abdomen and lower torso in a single bite. The teeth tore through her wetsuit, opened her abdominal wall, and severed major vessels along the iliac branch. The force slammed her against the ladder, and the shark released almost immediately, disappearing back into the murk without a second pass. Elena collapsed inward against the ladder, her lower body trailing blood into the water. The crew dragged her onto the platform within 20 seconds, but the internal damage was catastrophic. She lost consciousness on the deck and was pronounced dead before the boat could reach shore. Elena's family released a quiet statement thanking the dive community and asking for privacy. Local officials posted warnings along that stretch of coast for the rest of the season. Do you think the blame in Elena's case rests more on the operator's unsafe setup or on the decision to let divers enter the water under those conditions? Elena did everything right, except pause in the worst spot at the worst time. For Miranda, slipping into Maui's waters too early, the danger came not from the setup, but from what was already there. It was May 27, 2018, and the first light of morning was spreading across the water off Maui. The boat sat offshore in water cluttered with suspended debris, streaks of foam, and drifting organic matter moving through the area since a whale carcass had been reported farther offshore the day before. The scent trail alone can pull large scavenging predators in from miles away, especially in Hawaiian waters, where tiger sharks are already a dominant presence. Miranda Haley was 22 years old, a college student from Oregon on a graduation trip to Hawaii with 2 close friends. She'd spent the week snorkeling, road tripping, filming sunsets, and posting the trip online. The cage dive was supposed to be the final excursion before flying home. She wasn't a trained diver and had never done a shark cage experience before, but she'd booked with an operator advertising beginner-friendly encounters and guaranteed close footage. The company had noted active shark presence but hadn't canceled. The operator reviewed the report that morning. The carcass was believed distant, and early passes showed no unusual clustering. A subtle current shift was misread as routine drift, not a forming scent lane. Conditions seemed manageable. Miranda knew the company had flagged active shark presence, but she still went ahead. It's like she trusted the thrill more than the risk. During setup, before the boat was stabilized and before the crew was fully in position, Miranda entered the partially submerged cage early with her camera already rolling. She wanted footage from the first second. The briefing had covered the basics. Stay centered, keep arms inside the bars, wait for crew instruction. But the timing was off. The cage wasn't fully secured, visibility was poor, and the surrounding water carried the kind of scent trail that can turn a routine encounter into a feeding response without warning. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous large predators in tropical waters. They can grow well past 14 feet, weigh over 1,000 pounds, and don't need clear visibility to find a target. Their sense of smell is exceptional, and their feeding behavior is far less selective than a great white's. Miranda had moved toward the front bars to film downward into the water when the shark came in from below. It was a large tiger shark, estimated at around 12 feet, tracking along the scent lane, pushing in with the current beneath the cage. Because of the debris and low visibility, the approach wasn't seen clearly until the last second. Miranda raised her camera for a lower angle and extended her right arm slightly outside the bars. The shark accelerated and struck in one pass. The bite caught her forearm first, then carried upward into her torso as the shark's head hit the cage. The initial contact crushed the forearm, severed the brachial artery, and tore through the upper arm. As the jaws closed deeper into her side, the serrated teeth ripped open the lower chest and abdominal wall, causing massive trauma and rapid bleeding. The force slammed her against the bars and knocked the camera free. The shark released almost immediately and dropped away, leaving Miranda collapsed against the cage as blood spread through the water. This is the kind of attack where every second matters, and they were already behind before it even happened. The crew still had to fully secure the cage before lifting it. By the time Miranda was pulled onto the platform, she had already lost a catastrophic amount of blood. CPR was started, and emergency services were contacted, but the injuries were unsurvivable. She was pronounced dead before evacuation could reach the vessel. In the aftermath, investigators examined why the operation proceeded, despite warnings tied to offshore feeding conditions. Findings pointed to misjudgments, distance estimates, current interpretation, and assuming early conditions reflected overall risk. The company suspended tours pending the outcome. Miranda entered the cage too early, into water already marked by a feeding trail. Later in Grand Bahama, Silas stepped into another cage, a tiger shark circling below on the same deadly line. It was April 2, 2016, and the waters off Grand Bahama carried that steady, rolling movement that doesn't look dangerous until you're in it. The surface reflected a bright, flattened sky, but below, visibility dropped to around 20 to 25 feet, turning everything into shifting shapes and muted outlines. The current moved just enough to keep suspended equipment drifting slightly out of position. This trip wasn't advertised as a standard cage dive. The operator framed it as something more immersive, a modified setup designed to reduce visual obstruction and bring divers closer to the animals. Less steel, wider spacing, and a more open feel compared to traditional cages. Silas Mercer was 38, working a physically demanding job that didn't leave him much time for trips like this. When he did take one, he didn't want a watered-down version of the experience. People who knew him described him as someone who preferred things done fully. If there was a way to get closer, he would take it. I've reported on other stories where that same attitude mattered most. People wanted the absolute best experience, and that exact desire ended up being the most important part of what happened. That mindset lined up perfectly with what this operation was offering. The briefing reflected that tone. The crew emphasized awareness and balance, but didn't go deep into how the modified cage changed the level of protection. There was no detailed explanation of spacing tolerances, no comparison to standard safety designs, just a general instruction to stay inside and remain steady. When Silas entered the cage with his waterproof camera, the difference was obvious. The bars were spaced wider than what you'd expect in a typical setup. Not wide enough to step through, but wide enough that the barrier didn't feel solid anymore. When you looked out, the structure almost disappeared, giving a clearer, more direct view into the water. This setup was the perfect setup for photographs. That was the selling point, but it also meant the margin for error was thinner. At first, everything worked the way it was intended. A few sharks passed at a distance, moving in and out of the visibility range. The cage drifted slightly with the current, requiring constant small adjustments in footing. Then a larger tiger shark came into view. Witnesses later estimated it at around 11 to 12 feet, moving slowly along the lower edge of the cage. It didn't charge or rush. It circled, maintaining a controlled distance as it inspected the structure. Silas shifted to follow it. Using his waterproof camera, he took pictures of the animal. He lowered his stance and moved toward the front section where the visibility was best. One hand braced lightly against the bars as the cage moved under him, his focus locked on keeping the shark in frame. He stayed inside. That part never changed. He took photographs, selfies, and videos with the animal right around him. As the shark made another pass, it angled closer to the cage wall. Tiger sharks often investigate by moving along edges, turning slightly inward to test objects in their environment. When it passed the front section, the alignment was there. Silas's upper arm, pressed near the bars for balance, sat within the wider spacing, close enough that part of the soft tissue extended beyond the protective plane of the cage without fully crossing it. It wasn't something he could see. The shark made contact. Not a high-speed strike, but a controlled, investigative bite that became destructive because of the access. The jaws closed across his upper arm, pulling him into the bars as the force pinned him against the frame. The entire sequence lasted only seconds. When the shark released, Silas fell backward inside the cage. From above, the crew saw the disturbance and immediately began pulling the cage up, but retrieval still took time. The movement of the water and the weight of the structure slowed the process just enough to matter. By the time they got him onto the platform, he was already losing consciousness. The injury was high on the arm, near major vessels, making bleeding extremely difficult to control in that environment. The crew attempted emergency measures, but the severity and location of the wound left little room for stabilization. He was pronounced dead before reaching shore. Inspectors documented that the spacing between bars exceeded commonly accepted safety standards for large shark interactions. The structure was identified as a modified configuration that had not undergone formal testing or certification for that type of use. His camera was kept for the sole privacy of the victim. The official conclusion stated that the experimental design reduced the effectiveness of the protective barrier, allowing unintended exposure despite the diver remaining inside the cage. The operation was suspended shortly after. I have been in water where it was hard to see past 20 feet, and it felt creepy. Looking at Silas's situation, those big gaps in the cage would have made me second-guess everything I did. Silas Mercer reached a few inches too far, and in that water, it was enough. The story shifts to a shallow cage near Port St. John's, where Precy learns that calm water doesn't mean safety. It was January 12, 2018. The air over South Africa's eastern cape was heavy before a summer storm. A boat sat near the Mzimvubu River mouth off Port St. John's, a known bull shark hotspot. Murky, nutrient-rich water drew bait fish and predators. It was shallow near the cage, dropping sharply just yards away. Precy Boyd was 29 years old, a tourist from the Philippines on a backpacking trip through South Africa. She'd signed up for a shallow water cage experience, a newer type of tour being marketed as a less intense, safer alternative to the deep-water great white dives. The cage was smaller, the setup was simpler, and the whole operation was designed to feel more accessible. Unlike traditional fully enclosed cages, this one used a minimalist eco-design with a partially open bottom and wider lower rail gaps, allowing divers to stand with their fins slightly below the frame in the shallow water. Precy, according to friends she was traveling with, had specifically chosen this operator because she believed the shallow placement of the cage significantly reduced the risk. I get why she picked that operator. I probably would have thought the same thing. Shallow water, smaller cage, it sounds safer on paper, but hearing it now, I realize how much that belief can lull you into a false sense of security. The briefing that morning had been brief. The crew pointed out the drop-off, mentioned the low visibility, and gave the standard instructions about keeping limbs inside the cage. They did not emphasize how the open bottom design and lower rail spacing could allow a diver's legs or fins to drift just outside the protective frame if positioning wasn't controlled. Precy entered the water with two other divers, carrying her phone in a waterproof pouch to film a close-up selfie. She positioned herself near the outer bars, leaning against the cage wall to get a stable shot in the gentle current, her fins and lower legs subtly dipping below the cage's bottom edge with each shift of the water. Bull sharks are arguably the most adaptable and aggressive large predators on the planet. They can thrive in both salt and fresh water, are notoriously territorial, and are responsible for a huge percentage of coastal shark attacks worldwide. They typically grow to between 7 and 11 feet, but they are powerfully built, with a stocky frame and a bite force that, pound for pound, exceeds that of a great white. A bull shark, estimated at around 8 feet long, had moved into the area from the deeper channel, drawn by the scent and vibration of the cage and the people inside it. It approached low and slow, completely unseen in the murky water. As Prissy leaned outward to frame her selfie, her legs, no longer fully shielded by the cage due to the open bottom gap, hung just below the lower rails. The shark surged upward from beneath the cage and struck. The bite clamped onto her right thigh first, crushing and severing the femoral artery in a single catastrophic impact. As the shark thrashed, its head and body twisting violently, its teeth raked across her other leg, mangling it in the motion rather than cleanly biting both at once. The force of the hit drove her backward into the cage bars. The shark released almost immediately and vanished back into the murk before anyone else fully understood what had happened. Prissy collapsed inward, her body going limp as blood poured from the wounds, turning the water inside the cage dark in seconds. The divers beside her recoiled, pressed against the bars, shouting through their regulators as the current pulled the spreading cloud through the cage. The crew above reacted to the sudden bloom of blood in the water and began hauling the cage up, but the extraction took several crucial moments as they fought to stabilize it against the river's outflow current. By the time they got her onto the boat, the blood loss was too massive to control. She lost consciousness on the deck and was pronounced dead before they reached the shore. Investigators later confirmed that the proximity of the cage to the deep-water drop-off, combined with the extremely poor visibility, created a high-risk scenario that the divers weren't adequately warned about. For me personally, the lesson I get from Prissy's story is, if something feels safe only because it looks simpler or less intimidating, I need to ask myself, is it actually safer or just marketed that way?